Camilla James, the CEO of the largest airline in the United States, had built her empire with determination, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of purpose. At 42, she was a self-made billionaire who commanded respect in every room she entered. But Camilla wasn't one to rest on her laurels. She believed in staying connected to every aspect of her business, from the boardroom to the very planes that carried her company's name across the skies. This was why she often traveled incognito on her airline's flights, blending in as an ordinary passenger to personally observe the service, the crew, and the overall experience her customers received. To her, the success of the business wasn't just about profits, it was about maintaining the highest standards of safety, comfort, and respect for everyone who stepped onto her planes. Camilla's approach was meticulous. She dressed simply for these flights, opting for casual yet elegant outfits that didn't draw attention. She carried a modest backpack instead of luxury luggage, and she booked her seat in the economy class right in the middle of the action. She had no need for the first-class cabins or special treatment during these trips. Her goal was to experience what the majority of her customers did, and to assess the strengths and weaknesses of her company without filters or sugar-coating. This time was no different. The red-eye flight was scheduled to depart from Chicago and head to Los Angeles, and Camilla had chosen this specific route for her inspection. It was one of the busiest and most profitable routes for her airline, and she wanted to ensure that everything operated smoothly, even during the less glamorous overnight flights. Boarding the plane, Camilla moved with quiet confidence, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The boarding process seemed efficient, though she noticed a few subtle signs of impatience from the ground crew when dealing with passengers who were slower to get settled. Her keen observations extended to the passengers as well, the tired families juggling luggage, the business travelers glued to their phones, and the occasional solo flyer staring out of the terminal windows. Camilla had always been fascinated by the diverse stories that came together on every flight. Each passenger had their reasons for traveling, and to her, it was a reminder of the responsibility her company bore in ensuring their journey was as seamless as possible. Camilla took her assigned seat by the window, a strategic choice that gave her a better view of the aisle and the activity around her. She slid her backpack under the seat in front of her, keeping her laptop and notebook easily accessible. A quick glance at the overhead bin confirmed that her modest luggage fit well within the airline's requirements. It was a small detail, but one she always paid attention to. If her own bag had trouble fitting, she knew other passengers would likely face the same issue. As she adjusted herself in her seat, a shadow loomed over her. A man with a tall, stiff posture and an air of barely concealed disdain stood in the aisle. He was dressed in the navy blue uniform of the airline's flight attendants, though his name tag Zach Harper and forced smile didn't inspire much confidence. Camilla could tell immediately that Zach wasn't having a good day. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was something deeper, a chip on his shoulder that weighed heavily on his demeanor. Regardless, she wasn't here to judge personalities, she was here to evaluate performance. "Excuse me," Zach said tersely, gesturing to the small backpack Camilla had placed beneath her seat. "Is that yours? You need to make sure it doesn't stick out. We don't need anything blocking the aisle." Camilla nodded politely. "Of course," she replied, shifting the bag until it was perfectly aligned with the seat. Zach didn't acknowledge her effort, instead giving her a quick once-over with a look that bordered on disdain. To him, she must have seemed like just another passenger, probably someone who didn't belong in his idea of what a traveler should look like. His attitude wasn't explicitly rude, but it carried an undercurrent of condescension that Camilla didn't miss. The interaction was brief, but it left an impression. Camilla didn't react outwardly, choosing instead to focus on her surroundings. As the rest of the passengers boarded, Zach moved through the cabin with efficiency but little warmth. His interactions with others were transactional, lacking the kind of attentiveness and friendliness that Camilla knew should define the customer experience. A few rows behind her, a mother with 2 young children struggled to stow a bag in the overhead bin. Rather than offering assistance, Zach simply stood by, watching with impatience until another passenger stepped in to help. Camilla opened her notebook and began jotting down observations. Her pen moved swiftly across the page as she noted not only Zach's behavior but also the demeanor of the other flight attendants, the cleanliness of the cabin, and the flow of the boarding process. Her observations were sharp and detailed, though she kept her actions discreet. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself or her true identity. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Zach's attitude didn't improve. When the beverage service began, Camilla requested a glass of water. Zach brought it to her with a barely concealed scowl, slamming the glass onto her tray table without a word. The water sloshed dangerously close to the edge, and Camilla raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It wasn't her place to confront him, not yet. Instead, she made another note in her notebook, her calm demeanor masking the storm of thoughts running through her mind. Zach's behavior wasn't just about her. It was clear that his attitude extended to anyone he deemed unworthy of his time or effort. Camilla watched as he breezed past passengers who needed assistance, offering curt responses and dismissive gestures. His interactions were mechanical at best and outright hostile at worst. She could see the discomfort in the faces of the passengers, and it struck a chord in her. This wasn't just about bad service, it was about the kind of environment her company allowed to exist under its banner. Camilla didn't need to reveal her identity to know that this flight would lead to significant changes. She had dealt with employees like Zach before, people whose frustrations and biases translated into poor customer service. But this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. As the CEO of an airline, Camilla knew that every interaction mattered. Every passenger deserved to feel valued, respected, and safe. And every employee, from the ground crew to the flight attendants, represented her company in ways that could either build or break its reputation. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Camilla stared out of the window, her reflection blending with the darkness outside. She wasn't angry, not yet. Instead, she felt a quiet resolve. She had built this company from the ground up, overcoming countless challenges to make it one of the most respected airlines in the industry. She wasn't about to let someone like Zach Harper tarnish that legacy. This flight wasn't just another inspection, it was a reminder of why she had taken on this role in the first place. Camilla was here to ensure that every passenger, regardless of who they were or where they came from, received the best service possible. And she wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of that mission. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines created a soothing backdrop for most passengers. Camilla James, however, was far from relaxed. She leaned back slightly in her seat, her notebook open on the tray table in front of her. Her pen rested against her fingers as she processed the events of the last few minutes. Zach Harper's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was indicative of a deeper issue, one that Camilla had seen in certain employees before. His attitude wasn't merely a product of fatigue or stress. It was the result of a mindset that she knew could poison the very core of her company's culture if left unchecked. Camilla remained outwardly calm, but her eyes stayed sharp, watching Zach as he moved through the cabin. His interactions with passengers continued to lack any semblance of genuine care or courtesy. When a middle-aged man seated near the aisle politely asked for a blanket, Zach dismissed him with a curt, "We're out." Should have asked before takeoff. The man looked bewildered, clearly caught off guard by the dismissive tone, but he didn't argue. Zach didn't wait for a response, moving on to the next row with an air of indifference. Camilla jotted down another note, her handwriting crisp and precise. She made a conscious effort to document not just Zach's actions, but also the reactions of the passengers around him. Most people avoided making eye contact with him, likely sensing his hostility and preferring not to provoke it. It struck her how one employee's demeanor could cast such a shadow over an otherwise well-run operation. The other flight attendants were professional, polite, and efficient, but their efforts seemed overshadowed by Zach's abrasive energy. When the beverage cart reached her row, Camilla decided to test Zach further. As he stopped beside her, his movements mechanical, she looked up and gave him a polite smile. "May I have a coffee, please?" Zach didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to her notebook, where her pen rested against the open page. A flicker of something suspicion, annoyance crossed his face. "Coffee, huh?" he said, his tone flat. He reached for a cup with exaggerated slowness, as if the simple request were a monumental burden. "Yes, please," Camilla replied evenly, refusing to let his attitude rattle her. Zach poured the coffee, his movements sharp and deliberate. As he handed it to her, the cup wobbled slightly in his grip. Before Camilla could react, he tilted his hand just enough for the liquid to slosh over the rim and spill onto the tray table, splattering her notebook and barely missing her lap. He didn't apologize. Instead, he smirked, his voice dripping with full concern. "Oops. Looks like you should have held onto that better." Camilla's gaze locked onto his, her expression unreadable. She picked up a napkin from the tray table and calmly began dabbing at the spilled coffee. "Thank you for bringing it," she said softly, her voice steady. She made no attempt to address the spill or his tone, knowing that any escalation would only feed into whatever petty power trip he seemed to be on. Zach lingered for a moment, as if expecting her to complain or lash out. When she didn't, he clicked his tongue and pushed the cart down the aisle without another word. Camilla watched him go, her calm exterior masking the simmering frustration beneath. She wasn't angry for herself, not really. She'd dealt with people like Zach before, people who mistook civility for weakness. What angered her was the knowledge that he likely treated other passengers the same way, passengers who might not have the confidence or authority to challenge him. The rest of the cabin seemed to settle into a rhythm as passengers relaxed, some dozing off while others scrolled through their phones or read books. Camilla, however, remained vigilant. She observed how Zach interacted with others, noting how his demeanor shifted depending on the passenger. When a sharply dressed businessman in first class asked for a drink, Zach was all smiles and efficiency, his tone bordering on obsequious. But when a young woman with a crying baby asked for an extra bottle of water, his irritation was palpable. He rolled his eyes as he handed her the bottle, muttering under his breath as he moved away. Camilla's thoughts churned as she watched these interactions unfold. Zach's behavior wasn't just rude, it was strategically rude. He seemed to reserve his worst treatment for those he deemed unimportant, those who, in his mind, couldn't fight back. It was a pattern she couldn't ignore, and it reinforced her decision to escalate the matter once the flight landed. But for now, she chose to remain an observer, collecting evidence and staying under the radar. As the flight attendants prepared for the next round of service, Zach's attention returned to Camilla. She could feel his gaze on her as he passed by, his eyes flicking to her notebook and back again. It was clear he hadn't forgotten her earlier request, or the way she had refused to react to his provocations. His smirk returned as he approached her row once more, this time without the beverage cart. "Still taking notes?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. "What's that for? Some kind of Yelp review?" Camilla looked up at him, her expression calm. "Something like that," she said simply, closing the notebook and placing her pen on top. Zach chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "You know, people like you love to complain, but you've got no idea what it's like to actually do this job." Maybe you should try working a flight before you start writing your little critiques." Camilla tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the cracks in his facade, the insecurity behind the bravado, the frustration that fueled his hostility. But she wasn't here to fix him. She was here to ensure that her airline upheld the standards she had worked so hard to establish. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said evenly. "I'll keep that in mind." Her calm response seemed to unsettle him. He stood there for a moment longer, as if searching for something else to say, before turning abruptly and walking away. Camilla watched him go, her expression neutral but her mind racing. She had seen enough. Zach Harper was more than just a bad employee, he was a liability. His behavior not only jeopardized the customer experience, but also posed a risk to the company's reputation. She had no doubt that his actions would come to light during the post-flight debrief, and she was prepared to ensure that the consequences were swift and decisive. The flight continued without further incident, though the tension lingered in the air. Camilla spent the remainder of the journey reviewing her notes, occasionally glancing up to observe the crew. She noticed how the other flight attendants seemed to avoid Zach, their interactions with him brief and perfunctory. It was a subtle but telling sign that his attitude wasn't just directed at passengers, it likely extended to his colleagues as well. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Camilla closed her notebook and slid it back into her backpack. She had everything she needed. The flight itself had been smooth, the passengers generally cooperative, and the service from the other crew members acceptable. But Zach's behavior overshadowed all of that. It was a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and accountability, even in a company as successful as hers. Camilla fastened her seatbelt and prepared for landing, her expression calm but her mind resolute. She didn't know what Zach expected when the plane touched down, whether he would continue his dismissive behavior or simply move on to his next shift, oblivious to the storm he had created. What she did know was that his actions wouldn't go unanswered. The moment the plane reached the gate, Camilla would ensure that Zach Harper understood exactly who he had been dealing with. As the plane taxied to the gate, the tension that had simmered throughout the flight began to reach its boiling point. Camilla remained calm, her face an impassive mask that revealed none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She had endured enough from Zach Harper during the flight to know exactly what she was dealing with, a man who wielded his position as a tool for intimidation, whose condescension and thinly veiled hostility were aimed at those he believed couldn't. But Camilla wasn't the type to explode in the moment. She believed in precision, in timing, and in ensuring that when she acted, her actions would be decisive and carry weight. This wasn't just about her own experience, it was about what his behavior represented and the damage it could do to her company. The moment the plane came to a complete stop, Zach unbuckled his harness and stood abruptly. He moved through the cabin with the same stiff posture, barely glancing at passengers as he prepared for the disembarkation process. Camilla observed him from the corner of her eye as she neatly packed her notebook into her bag and zipped it shut. Zach hadn't looked her way since their last tense exchange, but she could feel his presence like a weight in the cabin. The other flight attendants went about their tasks with quiet professionalism, though there was an unspoken discomfort in their movements. It was clear they weren't blind to Zach's behavior but were either unwilling or unable to challenge him. Passengers began standing to retrieve their bags, the usual chaos of disembarkation taking hold. Camilla stayed seated, waiting for the aisle to clear, her patience masking the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She noticed Zach hovering near the front of the cabin, speaking in a low voice to one of his colleagues. The younger flight attendant nodded, her expression tight, and quickly turned away to assist passengers. Whatever Zach had said, it was enough to unsettle her. Camilla remained seated, letting the other passengers file out before her. She didn't want to be caught in the middle of the crowd. She wanted space, clarity, and a direct path to handle what she knew needed to be done. As the last of the passengers began moving toward the exit, Zach finally turned his gaze toward her. His eyes narrowed slightly, and that same smirk she'd seen earlier played on his lips. He clearly believed he'd won whatever unspoken battle had been playing out between them. Camilla, however, was far from defeated. She gave him a neutral look, one that betrayed none of her intentions, and stood up, retrieving her backpack and sliding it over her shoulder. As she made her way to the front of the cabin, Zach positioned himself near the exit, his stance casual but deliberately blocking part of the walkway. It was a subtle but intentional move, one that forced her to slow down as she approached. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence between them linger just long enough to make the interaction uncomfortable. Camilla met his gaze without flinching, her calm demeanor only deepening the tension. "Enjoy the flight?" he finally asked, his tone dripping with insincerity. Camilla tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "It was enlightening," she replied, her voice measured. Zach's smirk widened, and he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Next time, maybe try not to cause so much trouble. People like you make this job harder than it needs to be." For a moment, the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Camilla didn't respond immediately, allowing the weight of his statement to settle between them. Then, without breaking eye contact, she smiled faintly. "Thank you for your feedback," she said, her tone so calm it bordered on unnerving. Zach blinked, clearly thrown off by her response, but before he could recover, Camilla stepped past him and exited the plane. She didn't look back, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing any reaction other than calm composure. Outside the jet bridge, the terminal was bustling with activity. Passengers hurried toward baggage claim or their connecting gates, while airline staff moved efficiently through the space. Camilla scanned the crowd briefly before spotting a familiar figure, the airline's regional operations manager, David Ruiz, who had come to meet her as per protocol whenever she conducted one of her incognito inspections. David approached her with a warm, professional smile, his clipboard in hand. "MS. James," he greeted her in a low voice, careful not to draw attention to her identity. "Welcome back. I trust everything went smoothly." Camilla returned his smile, though hers carried a sharper edge. "Not exactly," she replied. "We need to have a conversation. Privately." David's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. This way." He led her to a quiet conference room tucked away near the terminal offices. As soon as the door closed behind them, Camilla set her bag on the table and crossed her arms, her demeanor shifting from cordial to authoritative. "I want the full personnel files for every crew member on that flight," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Particularly Zach Harper." David blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. "Zach Harper," he repeated, frowning. "Did something happen on the flight?" "Something happened. And I need to understand why," Camilla replied. "His behavior was unacceptable toward me, toward other passengers, and even toward his colleagues. If he's representative of the kind of staff we're putting in front of our customers, then we have a serious problem." David's frown deepened as he scribbled a note on his clipboard. "Understood. I'll pull his file immediately. Should I conduct an initial inquiry, or do you want to handle this directly?" "I'll handle it," Camilla said firmly. "But I want to know everything: his history with the company, any complaints filed against him, his performance reviews. If there's a pattern here, I need to see it." David nodded, already typing a message on his tablet. "I'll have the information ready within the hour. Do you want me to notify HR?" "Not yet," Camilla said. I want to speak to him first. David hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. You're planning to confront him directly, he asked. Camilla's gaze sharpened. Not confront, she corrected. Address. There's a difference. David wisely chose not to press the matter further. Understood, he said again. I'll make the arrangements. As he left the room to gather the necessary information, Camilla took a deep breath, centering herself. This wasn't the first time she'd had to deal with an employee whose behavior fell short of the company's standards, but something about Zach Harper struck a particularly deep nerve. Perhaps it was the calculated nature of his actions, the way he wielded his position as a weapon rather than a tool for service. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that if she hadn't been on that flight, his behavior might have gone unchecked, leaving countless other passengers and colleagues to bear the brunt of his hostility. Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for certain: this situation would not be swept under the rug. When David returned with the personnel files, Camilla's suspicions were confirmed. Zach Harper had a history of complaints, several incidents involving rude or dismissive behavior toward passengers, a few notes about conflicts with other staff members, and a performance review that described him as efficient but difficult. The pattern was clear, and it only strengthened her resolve. Where is he now? Camilla asked, closing the file. He's still at the gate, David replied. The crew is debriefing before their next assignment. Good, Camilla said, standing. Let's not keep him waiting. The walk back to the gate was brisk, and Camilla's mind was already focused on the conversation ahead. When they arrived, Zach was standing near the counter, chatting with another flight attendant. His posture was relaxed, his smirk firmly in place, as if the events of the flight had already faded from his mind. But the moment he saw Camilla and David approaching, his expression shifted. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, quickly masked by his usual bravado. Mr. Harper, Camilla said as they reached him. Her voice was calm, but the authority in her tone was unmistakable. We need to talk. Zach's smirk faltered, and for the first time that day, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself. Camilla stood face to face with Zach Harper, her calm yet authoritative demeanor cutting through the bustling activity around them. She noticed the slight twitch of his jaw, the faint sheen of sweat forming on his temple. For the first time during the entire ordeal, the confidence he had weaponized throughout the flight seemed to waver. Beside her, David Ruiz, the regional operations manager, remained silent but alert, ready to intervene if needed. Camilla, however, had no intention of involving anyone else until it was absolutely necessary. This was her company, her responsibility, and Zach Harper was about to understand exactly who he had been dealing with. Is there a problem? Zach asked, his voice laced with defensive bravado. He crossed his arms, an attempt to appear nonchalant, though his rigid posture betrayed his unease. Yes, Camilla replied evenly, her eyes locked onto his. We need to address your behavior on Flight 317. Now. Zach's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual sharpness. Oh, this is about that. Look, if you had a bad experience, you're welcome to file a complaint. I'm sure customer service will. I'm not filing a complaint, Mr. Harper, Camilla interrupted, her voice firm but calm. I'm addressing it directly with you. Zach's expression darkened, his smirk vanishing entirely. Who are you to address anything with me? He asked, his tone edging into hostility. David started to step forward, but Camilla raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. She wasn't here to escalate the situation, not yet. Instead, she let the silence hang for a moment, allowing Zach's words to echo back at him. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached into her bag and pulled out her company ID, holding it up for him to see. I'm Camilla James, she said, her tone steady but cold. CEO of this airline. The airline you work for. The color drained from Zach's face. For a moment he stood frozen, as if his brain was struggling to process the words. Then his eyes flicked to David, who gave a single, solemn nod. There was no mistaking the truth. Camilla saw the realization dawn in Zach's expression, the dawning horror that the woman he had belittled, mocked, and outright disrespected during the flight wasn't just another passenger. She was the head of the entire operation, the person with the authority to make or break his career. MS. James, Zach began, his tone shifting to something resembling respect, though the strain in his voice was obvious. I didn't realize. No, you didn't, Camilla cut him off. And that's exactly the problem. She stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. Your behavior on that flight was unacceptable toward me, toward other passengers, and even toward your colleagues. I've reviewed your file, Mr. Harper, and I see that this isn't the first time your attitude has been called into question. Complaints have been filed against you before, haven't they? Zach hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. I mean, maybe there have been a few misunderstandings, he stammered, but nothing serious. Nothing serious, Camilla repeated, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Rudeness to passengers, hostility toward your co-workers, a documented history of refusing to comply with company standards. Tell me, Mr. Harper, do you think any of that reflects well on this airline? Zach's face flushed, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. Look, I've been under a lot of stress, he said, his tone bordering on pleading. This job isn't easy. The passengers can be demanding and sometimes things get heated. I didn't mean anything personal. Camilla raised an eyebrow. You didn't mean anything personal. Is that your justification for spilling coffee on me, for ignoring passenger requests, for belittling a mother traveling with her child? Because from where I was sitting, it certainly seemed personal. Zach shifted uncomfortably, his arms falling to his sides. I didn't know who you were, he muttered. And that's supposed to make it better, Camilla shot back. Would your behavior have been any more acceptable if I weren't the CEO? If I were just another passenger? Because let me make one thing clear, every single person who boards one of our planes deserves respect, regardless of their title, their background, or how much they paid for their ticket. Your job is to serve with professionalism and dignity, not to pick and choose who you think is worthy of your respect. David stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Harper, the CEO has made it clear that your actions today were entirely out of line. This is a serious matter, and I suggest you take it as such. Zach's jaw tightened, but he nodded, clearly realizing that he was in no position to argue. I understand, he said, though his voice was strained. It won't happen again. Camilla studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze piercing through the thin veil of contrition he had hastily thrown on. I'm not sure I believe that, she said bluntly. But we'll see. Effective immediately, you're suspended from active duty pending a formal review. You'll be contacted by HR with further instructions. Zach's eyes widened, and for a moment it looked as though he might argue. But then he seemed to think better of it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Camilla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence linger, watching as the weight of her words settled over him. Finally, she stepped back, her posture still commanding. You're dismissed, Mr. Harper. David will ensure you're escorted out. Zach nodded again, his face pale, and turned to leave. David motioned for a security officer nearby to accompany him, and the two walked away without another word. Camilla remained standing in the now quiet gate area, her arms crossed as she watched them go. She didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, only resolute. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability, about ensuring that the standards she had worked so hard to build were upheld at every level. David turned back to her, his expression one of quiet admiration. "That was decisive," he said. "I'll follow up with HR and make sure the review is thorough." "Good," Camilla replied. "I want every incident in his record examined, and I want to know if there were any missed opportunities to address this sooner. If this behavior was allowed to continue, that's on us as much as it's on him." David nodded, his respect for her leadership evident in his expression. "Understood. Is there anything else I can do?" Camilla thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. I want a full review of the crew culture on that route. Talk to the other flight attendants, both from today and from previous flights. Find out if this kind of behavior is more widespread than we realize, and make it clear to everyone that our zero-tolerance policy for misconduct is exactly that, zero tolerance." "I'll get on it right away," David said. "And, Ms. James, thank you for handling this personally." Camilla offered a faint smile. "This is my company, David. I don't take that responsibility lightly." As he left to begin his tasks, Camilla allowed herself a moment to exhale, the tension of the encounter slowly ebbing away. She knew there was still work to be done, still questions to be answered, and changes to be made. But for now, she felt a sense of clarity, of purpose. Zach Harper had underestimated her, as had many others before him. But she hadn't built her empire by letting challenges go unaddressed. And she wasn't about to start now. The conference room was silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Camilla James sat at the head of the polished wooden table, her presence commanding even without speaking. She tapped her pen lightly against a notepad, reviewing the details of the report David Ruiz had prepared on Zach Harper's tenure with the airline. The document painted a damning picture: numerous complaints from both passengers and co-workers, accusations of unprofessional conduct, and performance reviews that described him as combative and dismissive. It was clear that Zach's issues were not isolated to the events of Flight 317. They were part of a pattern, one that should have been addressed long before Camilla had to step in personally. David sat across from her, his expression tense as he waited for her reaction. He had spent the last several hours compiling everything Camilla had requested, and the weight of the findings was not lost on him. "It's worse than we thought," he finally said, breaking the silence. "The complaints go back years. Some were addressed, but others slipped through the cracks. It looks like certain supervisors were hesitant to escalate issues with him." Camilla looked up, her sharp gaze piercing through him. "Why?" she asked, her tone cold but measured. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's hard to say. Some of the notes in his file mention his strong personality and how he could be difficult to manage. I suspect some supervisors didn't want to deal with the potential fallout of disciplining him. They might have thought it was easier to let things slide." "Easier for them," Camilla replied, her voice laced with quiet anger. "But not for the passengers or the rest of the crew." David nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of her words. "I take full responsibility for the oversight. This should have been flagged a long time ago." "You're right," Camilla said bluntly, though there was no malice in her tone. "But this isn't just about you. It's about a systemic failure to enforce our standards. Zach Harper is a symptom of a larger problem, and if we don't address it now, we're going to see more incidents like this." David's jaw tightened, and he straightened in his seat. "What do you need from me?" Camilla leaned back, her pen still tapping lightly against the pad of paper in front of her. "I want a full audit of how personnel issues are handled at every level of this company. I want to know why supervisors felt they couldn't escalate complaints, and I want to ensure that going forward, No one gets away with this kind of behavior. It'll take some time, David admitted. But I'll make it a priority. Good, Camilla said. Because this isn't just about damage control. It's about rebuilding trust with our employees, our customers, and the public. And that starts with accountability. As David nodded and made a note on his tablet, the door to the conference room opened, and one of the airline's senior HR representatives stepped inside. The woman, a composed figure named Evelyn Grant, carried a folder that looked as weighty as the situation itself. She greeted Camilla with a polite nod before taking a seat next to David. I understand we're dealing with a serious matter, Evelyn began, opening the folder. I've reviewed Mr. Harper's file, as well as the incident report from Flight 317. Based on the evidence, it's clear that disciplinary action is not just warranted but necessary. Camilla arched an eyebrow. Disciplinary action? That's putting it mildly. Evelyn hesitated, clearly aware of the tension in the room. Given the severity of his actions, we can proceed with termination. However, we need to ensure that the process is handled carefully to avoid any legal complications. Mr. Harper has a history of pushing back against authority, and it's possible he could contest the decision. Camilla's eyes narrowed. Contest it? On what grounds? The man has a documented history of misconduct. He's alienated passengers, created a hostile work environment, and tarnished the reputation of this company. What possible defense could he have? Evelyn remained composed, though there was a flicker of unease in her expression. I agree that the evidence against him is overwhelming. But termination is a serious step, and we need to ensure it's airtight. If he files a wrongful termination claim, it could draw negative attention to the company. Camilla let out a quiet breath, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. I understand your concerns, Evelyn, but let me be clear, this is not just about protecting the company's image. This is about doing what's right. Zach Harper is a liability, and allowing him to remain employed here would send a message that we tolerate his behavior. That is not the message I'm willing to send. Evelyn nodded, clearly weighing her next words carefully. Then I suggest we meet with Mr. Harper directly. Give him an opportunity to respond to the allegations before we proceed with termination. It's not required, but it could help mitigate the risk of backlash. Camilla considered this for a moment. She didn't relish the idea of giving Zach another platform to defend himself, but she also knew the importance of transparency and due process. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it the right way. Schedule the meeting, she said finally. I want it done today. Evelyn nodded, standing to leave. I'll arrange it immediately. As the door closed behind her, Camilla turned back to David. I want you in that meeting, she said, and I want a security presence there as well. I don't trust him not to escalate things. David nodded, his expression grim. Understood. The meeting was set for later that afternoon, in a private office on the second floor of the terminal. Camilla arrived early, accompanied by David and 2 security officers who stood discreetly outside the door. The room was stark and professional, with a long table and minimal decoration. Camilla took her seat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable as she reviewed her notes one final time. David sat to her right, his posture tense but resolute. Evelyn entered a few moments later, carrying a recorder and a stack of documents. Finally, Zach Harper was escorted in by a 3rd security officer. His expression was a mix of defiance and unease, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a fight. He took the seat opposite Camilla, his movements stiff and deliberate. For a moment, no one spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Harper, Camilla began, her voice calm but firm. Thank you for joining us. This meeting is to address the incident on Flight 317, as well as your overall conduct during your time with this company. Zach leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Am I being fired? He asked bluntly. That will depend on the outcome of this meeting, Camilla replied. We're here to give you an opportunity to explain your actions and respond to the allegations against you. Zach's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. This is a joke, right? All of this because some passengers got their feelings hurt? You have no idea what it's like to deal with the people we get on these flights. They're rude, entitled, and half of them don't even know how to follow simple instructions. But I'm the bad guy here. Camilla's eyes remained locked on his, unflinching. This isn't about the passengers, Mr. Harper. This is about you, your attitude, your behavior, and your repeated failure to uphold the standards of this company. You have a responsibility to treat every person on that plane with respect, regardless of how you feel about them. That is the job you signed up for. If you can't handle it, you shouldn't be here. Zach's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. Easy for you to say. You're not the one getting yelled at by passengers every day. No, Camilla said sharply. I'm the one responsible for ensuring that every employee of this airline does their job with integrity. And you, Mr. Harper, have repeatedly failed to meet that standard. The conversation continued, with Zach growing increasingly defensive and combative. He attempted to deflect blame, bringing up perceived injustices and frustrations he had faced in his role. But Camilla refused to let him off the hook. She methodically dismantled each of his excuses, presenting the evidence of his misconduct with calm precision. By the end of the meeting, Zach's bravado had all but crumbled. When Camilla finally delivered the verdict, termination effective immediately, he sat in stunned silence, his defiance replaced by a cold, sinking realization. Security escorted him out of the room, leaving Camilla and her team to finalize the necessary paperwork. As she gathered her things, Camilla felt no satisfaction in the outcome. There was no triumph in holding someone accountable for their failures, only the quiet resolve of knowing she had done what was necessary. But as she left the terminal that evening, she carried with her the certainty that her company was stronger for it, and that the standards she had built would endure, no matter the challenges. The tension in the conference room lingered even after Zach Harper had been escorted out. Camilla James remained seated at the head of the table, her posture as poised and unyielding as it had been throughout the confrontation. Her gaze lingered momentarily on the closed door, as though she were reflecting on the events that had just transpired. Zach's attempt to deflect blame, to portray himself as a victim of the job rather than the architect of his own failures, had been predictable yet grating. Still, she felt no triumph in the resolution. This wasn't about personal satisfaction, it was about preserving the integrity of her company and the values it stood for. David Ruiz broke the silence, his voice hesitant but steady. That was the right call, he said, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. You handled that better than most would. Camilla turned her attention to him, her sharp gaze softening slightly. It wasn't about handling him, she said. It was about sending a message to everyone who works here and everyone who flies with us. Behavior like his is not just unacceptable, it's intolerable. And now they all know it. David nodded, though the weight of the situation was still evident in his features. HR will finalize the termination paperwork by the end of the day, he assured her, and I'll personally follow up with the other crew members from that flight. If there's anything else. There is, Camilla interrupted, her tone measured but firm. This isn't just about Zach Harper. He was a symptom of a larger issue. I need to know if there are more like him employees who think they can act with impunity because no one's paying attention. I want a full audit of crew feedback, passenger complaints, and performance reviews across every route. If there are patterns, I want them addressed immediately." David scribbled her instructions onto his notepad, his respect for her leadership evident in his focus. "Understood. I'll get the ball rolling today." Camilla nodded, then stood, gathering her belongings with the precision of someone who was always prepared for the next step. "I also want a meeting with our training and onboarding team. If there are gaps in how we prepare our employees for this job or in how we reinforce our values, that's on us. And I won't allow that to continue." Her words hung in the air with the weight of a declaration. David stood as well, his posture straightening as though her resolve had bolstered his own. "I'll coordinate with them immediately," he said. Camilla offered a faint, approving smile before walking toward the door. "Thank you, David. Keep me updated." As she stepped out into the corridor, the quiet buzz of the terminal seeped back into her awareness. The familiar sounds of announcements over the PA system and the hum of conversations reminded her that the world beyond this isolated incident continued to move forward. But for Camilla, the events of the past day had crystallized something important, something that extended far beyond Zach Harper's termination. This was about the culture she had built, the standards she had fought to uphold, and the future she envisioned for her company. She made her way to her private office, where Evelyn Grant, the senior HR representative, was waiting for her. Evelyn stood as Camilla entered, her expression professional yet tinged with curiosity. "Ms. James," she greeted. "I've just received confirmation that Mr. Harper has left the premises. Security ensured the process was smooth." "Good," Camilla replied, setting her bag on the desk. "And the formal termination notice?" "Already sent," Evelyn said, handing her a copy of the document. "It outlines the specific incidents that led to his dismissal, as well as the broader context of his performance issues. We've documented everything thoroughly to protect the company from any potential legal challenges." Camilla scanned the document briefly, her sharp eyes catching every detail. Satisfied, she placed it back on the desk and looked up at Evelyn. "Thank you. What about the rest of the crew from Flight 317? Have they been debriefed?" Evelyn hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Not yet. I was waiting for your direction on how to proceed. Some of them may be hesitant to speak freely, given the circumstances." Camilla leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she considered this. "Schedule individual meetings with each of them," she said after a moment. "Let them know they're in a safe space to share their experiences. And make it clear that this isn't just about one flight, it's about creating an environment where everyone feels supported and respected." Evelyn nodded, making a note in her planner. "I'll handle it personally. And the passengers? Should we reach out to anyone who filed complaints?" Camilla's gaze sharpened. "Yes, but only after we've implemented the changes I have in mind. I don't want to offer empty apologies. When we reach out, it'll be to show them exactly how we're addressing the issues they experienced." Evelyn smiled faintly, clearly impressed by Camilla's approach. "Understood. I'll get started on this immediately." As Evelyn left the office, Camilla allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what needed to be done. The termination of Zach Harper was a necessary step, but it was only the beginning. The incident had exposed cracks in the foundation of her company's culture, and she was determined to repair them before they widened into something irreparable. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from David. "We've identified a few more employees with similar complaints in their records. Sending you the details now." Camilla's jaw tightened as she read the message. The problem was indeed larger than just one man. But if there was one thing she had learned in her years of building and leading this company, it was that challenges were opportunities in disguise. This wasn't a setback, it was a chance to reinforce the values that had made her airline one of the most respected in the industry. She replied quickly, instructing David to begin addressing the other cases immediately. Then, without hesitation, she opened her laptop and began drafting a company-wide message. The words came easily, fueled by her conviction and the clarity of her vision. To all employees. Today, we took decisive action to address a breach of the values that define who we are as a company. Let me be clear: respect, professionalism, and accountability are not optional here, they are the foundation of everything we do. As your leader, I am committed to ensuring that these values are upheld at every level of our organization, and as members of this team, I expect each of you to hold yourselves and each other to the highest standards. Together, we will continue to build an airline that we can all be proud of. The work starts now. She read the message over once, then hit send. The weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where complacency and mediocrity had no place. Camilla had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but she welcomed them. After all, it was in moments like this that true leadership was tested. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the terminal, Camilla rose from her desk and prepared to leave. She had meetings to schedule, changes to implement, and a company to strengthen. But for now, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The standards she had set weren't just words, they were actions. And today she had proven that those standards would endure, no matter what. The following weeks were transformative for Camilla James's airline. The termination of Zach Harper had sent shockwaves through the company, reverberating from the corporate offices to the crew break rooms. Employees whispered about the incident, though most details were unknown to them. What they did know was clear: the CEO herself had personally intervened to address an issue that had long been festering within the ranks. For some, it was a wake-up call; for others, it was a breath of fresh air, a sign that the company's leadership was serious about its commitment to excellence. Camilla, however, wasn't one to let the ripples of change fade into the background. She knew that symbolic gestures weren't enough. Real change demanded action, accountability, and follow-through. In the days following Zach's departure, she immersed herself in the work of rebuilding trust within the organization. Meetings were scheduled, plans were set in motion, and every level of the company felt the impact of her leadership. One of Camilla's first priorities was to address the cultural issues that had allowed someone like Zach to operate unchecked for so long. She called for a comprehensive review of the company's training programs, focusing not only on technical skills but also on the interpersonal and ethical standards expected of every employee. She personally worked with the training team to design new modules that emphasized empathy, conflict resolution, and the importance of maintaining professionalism under pressure. These changes weren't just mandatory for new hires, they were rolled out company-wide, ensuring that even the most seasoned employees were reminded of what the airline stood for. At the same time, Camilla initiated a feedback program that allowed employees to anonymously report misconduct or concerns without fear of retaliation. The program was paired with a dedicated team of HR professionals tasked with investigating complaints swiftly and thoroughly. Camilla wanted to ensure that no one in her company felt powerless or unheard. If someone like Zach Harper began to slip through the cracks again, she wanted the systems in place to catch it before it became a pattern. The feedback program also extended to passengers. Camilla personally oversaw the development of a more transparent and accessible system for passengers to share their experiences, both good and bad. It wasn't just about addressing complaints, it was about creating a dialogue between the airline and the people it served. Every comment was reviewed, and recurring issues were flagged for immediate attention. Camilla believed that listening to her customers was the key to maintaining the airline's reputation and staying ahead of the competition. As these changes began to take root, Camilla found herself in yet another meeting with her leadership team. They were gathered in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the table. David Ruiz and Evelyn Grant sat on either side of her, while other senior managers filled the remaining seats. A large monitor displayed the latest updates on the company's performance metrics, and the mood in the room was cautiously optimistic. Passenger satisfaction ratings are up 6% since last month, one of the managers reported. The feedback we've received about the updated service standards has been overwhelmingly positive. And complaints about crew behavior, Camilla asked, her tone direct but measured. Evelyn flipped through a stack of papers before responding. They've decreased by nearly 30% across all routes. It seems the new training programs are making a difference. Camilla nodded, though her expression remained serious. That's good progress, but we're not finished. I want to see those numbers drop even further. And I want to know if there are any outliers, routes, or teams that aren't improving as quickly as the others. We're tracking that as well, David interjected. There are a few routes where the feedback hasn't shifted as much as we'd like. I'll have a detailed report on those by the end of the week. Good, Camilla said. Let's make sure we're not overlooking anything. This isn't just about fixing the obvious problems, it's about setting a new standard across the board. The meeting continued, with each department head providing updates on their respective areas of focus. Camilla listened intently, her sharp mind absorbing every detail. When the meeting finally adjourned, she lingered in the room with David and Evelyn, her thoughts clearly still racing. You've done an incredible amount of work in the past few weeks, Evelyn said, her tone warm but professional. I hope you know how much of an impact it's already had. Camilla allowed herself a small smile, though her eyes remained focused. Thank you, Evelyn. But the work isn't about me, it's about what we're building here. This company is more than just a business. It's a promise to every person who steps onto one of our planes, and I intend to keep that promise. Evelyn nodded, clearly inspired by her words. If there's anything else you need from me, just let me know. Same here, David added. We've got your back. Camilla appreciated their support, though she knew the real measure of success wouldn't come from her leadership team. It would come from the employees on the front lines, the flight attendants, the ground crew, the people who interacted with passengers every day. They were the face of the company, and their actions would determine whether the changes she'd implemented truly took hold. A week later, Camilla decided it was time for another unannounced inspection. She booked herself on a mid-morning flight to Dallas, once again choosing to travel in economy class. This time, however, she noticed a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The crew was attentive and professional, their interactions with passengers marked by genuine warmth and care. When she requested a cup of coffee, it was delivered promptly and with a smile. The flight attendant even took the time to ask if she needed anything else. Camilla observed these interactions quietly, taking note of the positive energy that seemed to permeate the cabin. She could see the effects of the training programs and the cultural shifts she'd worked so hard to implement. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments where things could be improved, but the progress was undeniable. As the plane touched down in Dallas, she felt a sense of pride that she rarely allowed herself to indulge in. Back at the corporate office, Camilla began drafting a message to her employees. She wanted to acknowledge the progress they had made while reminding them that the work was far from over. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, the words coming easily as she reflected on the journey the company had taken. To my incredible team. Over the past few weeks, We faced challenges that tested us in ways we never anticipated. But we didn't back down. We came together to address those challenges head-on, and the results speak for themselves. I'm proud of the progress we've made, but I want to be clear this is only the beginning. We are building something extraordinary, a culture of respect, excellence, and integrity that will define our company for years to come. To each of you who has embraced this vision, thank you. Your dedication and hard work are what make this airline great. And to those who are still finding their way, know that we're here to support you. Together, we can achieve something truly remarkable. Let's keep moving forward. She reread the message, then hit send. Within moments, responses began pouring in, messages of gratitude, encouragement, and commitment from employees across the company. It was a reminder of why she did what she did, of the impact a single leader could have when they refused to compromise on their values. As the sun set outside her office window, Camilla leaned back in her chair, a rare moment of quiet settling over her. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. After all, leadership wasn't about avoiding challenges, it was about meeting them head-on, with courage, conviction, and the unwavering belief that change was always possible.